welcome to the second video of the Closer course, which comes to you from the Isle of Wedmore Benefice here in Somerset. And as you can see, I'm not in my usual studio, but actually I'm here in the churchyard of Field, and just behind me here you can just see the beautiful Mendip Hills. And this is the second of 5 videos, one of which will appear each week in the run-up to Lent. And this week we're thinking about why we remember things past. Why are the things in our lives that have happened to us, where we've lived, what we've done, why are they so important? And that's what we're thinking about in this video.
Almost 10 years ago, on a Saturday morning, I was at work and I felt pain in my right ear. And in an instant I noticed that I wasn't hearing in quite the same way. And although I didn't realise it at the time, my life was about to change quite dramatically. At that point I'd worn hearing aids for over 25 years, and until that time my hearing had been pretty stable. There hadn't been very many changes to my audiogram. But after going for a hearing test a couple of weeks later, I was told that my mild and moderate hearing loss had suddenly become a severe to profound hearing loss, and at some point in the future I was going to have a cochlear implant. There were speech sounds that I could no longer hear. Many of the high frequency sounds, like birdsong for instance, I can no longer hear. And at that time it was such a shock. For the next few weeks I drove myself to distraction, listening to what I was listening to, measuring every sound with how it sounded now against how it sounded only a few weeks and days before. And then I began to think about the future, and I began to think, well, what am I going to do about work when I'm as deaf as a post? What am I going to do for money? Am I going to have to rely on my family? Am I going to have to give up my independence? What does all this mean? And as a Christian of some years who had read all the scriptures, read all the Bible passages, thought I had all the answers, suddenly I had absolutely none. Everything was different. The films I liked, the music, the sounds that comforted me in my daily routine. My own voice in the shower, for instance, didn't quite sound the same. The world generally, for me, was a different place. And these things did not make me feel like this super spiritual Christian that I was supposed to be. They made me feel vulnerable, they made me feel weak, and they made me feel human. And yet it was over several years later that I revisited these memories, because I found it such a hard thing to do because of how it made me feel. And it was only when I was going through the discernment process and starting to train for ordained ministry that I was able to do that. And it was then that I began to see that God was with me, and that through those experiences my faith somehow was strengthened, so much so that we wouldn't be talking together today if it were not for that experience. And I learned that I needed to revisit that memory. I needed to go back into my past, not on my own and think things through in a rational way, but I needed to do it with God. And I needed to receive from him his peace. I needed his love, I needed his mercy, and I needed his forgiveness. And I learned that to feel all of those things, to feel weak, to feel human, to feel vulnerable, that is not abnormal, it's not strange, and it isn't weakness in any form. Actually, it's pretty normal. Rather, to feel those things is the very essence of what it means to be human. And more to the point, it's the beginning of understanding what it means to be human. The word human is derived from the Latin word humus, which means earth or ground. And when we look back and when we remember what we are, dust, earth, soil, we know where we've come from, and we know, more importantly, where we're going. And that is very much part of the Lent journey, isn't it? And that makes us humble. Being humble means that we are brought down to earth. when my hearing started to fail, I was brought down to earth. And being brought down to earth culminates with a cultivation of being of receiving a spirit of humility. And a spirit of humility is not thinking any more highly of ourselves than we ought to. When my hearing started to get worse, one of the things that I noticed first of all was that I was more attentive than ever to the needs of the world around me and to the needs of others. Being humble and having a spirit of humility helps us to receive from God, and it ushers us into his presence. And when we're closer to him, it helps us to see more clearly when we look back on our lives, and it helps us to see that God was there. It helps us to know that God is here right now, and it helps us to understand that wherever we are in the future, God is also there too. Remembrance and remembering help us to see God at work, and it deepens our relationship with him. But there's one final thing that I think remembering things past does, and ultimately I believe that is remembering reminds us who our source is, and it reminds us where our help comes from. And it teaches us in every season of life not to rely on our own skills and abilities, but in all our ways to look to him and to trust and acknowledge him. And it teaches us to remember the power of the cross and to be led by the Holy Spirit the Holy Spirit does. And that's why we remember things past.
Well, that brings us to the end of our second week of Closer. I hope you've enjoyed having a look at the remembrance of things past. Don't forget, you can join us again next week when we are going to be thinking about standing firm. But from me, Field Churchyard and the Mendip Hills, join me again next week. See you soon. Bye for now.